Hello everyone. Thank you for taking the time for joining this webinar. My name is Tarun Anumol and I'm the Director for Agilent's Global Environment and Food Markets. I want to spend the next few minutes talking to you and looking into the future about the PFAS lab of the future. So I want to talk a little bit about what labs in the future that are doing PFAS analysis actually will be doing and how they can maximize and optimize efficiency and throughput. So the summary of today's talk and just what we'll be talking about is we'll quickly discuss some of the market dynamics and challenges for PFAS testing. We'll also talk about when looking into the future, what will be the offerings from a full service PFAS lab? What are the methods they'll be running and how will they be doing this? More importantly, we'll discuss some of the driving factors on how these labs will actually optimize and efficiently run these PFAS samples so they can make maximum revenue. And then we'll also finally talk about what affects these costs. What can these labs do to increase efficiency, maximize throughput, and also provide the highest level of data compliance and integrity. So without further ado, let's all step into the PFAS lab of the future. So the first thing that's really important, and I'm sure many of you know if you're joining this webinar, is to understand what actually PFAS are. So PFAS stand for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances or per and polyfluorinated alkyl substances. The big difference being that a perfluorinated alkyl substance is one where in the alkyl chain, the carbons that are linked to the hydrogen, all the hydrogens are replaced by the fluorine atom. You'll notice an example here is PFOS, where all the hydrogens that are linked to the carbon in a traditional alkyl chain are replaced by fluorine atoms. Whereas a polyfluorinated alkyl substance is when some but not all the hydrogen atoms that are linked to the carbon in an alkyl chain are substituted by a fluorine. So an example here would be 6,2-FTS, where you notice that there are a couple of alkyl chain links that have carbon hydrogen and the others have a carbon fluorine link. So when it comes to both chemical properties and also the way they behave in instrumentation for the measurement, they can be slightly different whether it's a perfluoroalkyl substance or a polyfluoroalkyl substance. Now, I'm showing a slightly older paper here, but it highlights the point really well. And what it points to is, we know that there are upwards of 4,000 PFAS that are present in commerce. And there are many different classes of PFAS as well. So this paper by Wang et al. Talks about 14 different subclasses of PFAS. And you'll notice on the right-hand side, when you look at number of peer-reviewed articles, you'll notice that while some of them are well studied, especially the perfluorocarboxylic acids and the perfluorosulfonic acids, where PFOA and PFAS fall under, you'll notice that there are many newer categories and newer classes of PFAS that really are not well studied at all, and we still continue to find new classes of PFAS in the environment. So what this is telling us is that our understanding of the PFASs in the environment is very limited, and we know that there are potentially significantly a large number of PFAS that are in the environment that we haven't measured yet or we don't even know that are present yet. When we discuss the PFAS testing boom, I like to call it a gold rush and a race to the bottom. Why do I say that? Because a gold rush, because there's potentially a lot of money that is associated with PFAS testing. For example, an estimated PFAS total remediation costs exceed 80 billion US dollars. We've seen more than 400 million in US dollars appropriated by the US government for PFAS testing, treatment, and remediation just in 2020. And when I talk about race to the bottom, we're really talking about different regulations. I'm just highlighting the case for the US here, where federally there is a public health drinking water health advisory for just two PFAS of PFOA and PFAS at a combined 70 nanograms per liter. But several states in the US have taken it upon themselves to have more stringent and stricter regulations. And these can be in many different kinds. In fact, I'm just highlighting a few states here. There are many other states that have regulation as well. But what I want to highlight here is when you look at some states like California, for example, they have very, very low, like single digit part per trillion levels for monitoring of PFOA and PFAS in drinking water. And then you have other states like North Carolina, for example, that have newer PFAS like Gen X that have regulatory or guidance levels as well. And then further, you have states like Massachusetts that have gone more towards the precautionary principle where they regulate PFAS as a class of compound. And so they have a drinking water guidance of a total PFAS of 70 nanograms per liter, so a sum of that. And then again, you have states that use variations of this, such as Minnesota, Michigan, Wisconsin, New Jersey. So basically, the guidance, the regulatory guidance in the states is all over the board, and levels only continue to drop, and more newer PFAS are added to these regulatory levels. This is also a concern to water treatment plant operators as well. In a recent survey in the US, 71% of US water operators listed PFAS among their top priority water quality issues. So it is, in the mind of both wastewater operators and also the public as well. So before I go into more of the talk, what I'm not going to do today at this talk is I'm not going to go over the specifics of regulatory methods and testing, like EPA methods and ASTM methods and ISO methods. I'm going to actually focus more on the methodologies or the kinds of testing and how to optimize them that a lab of the future would be doing. But if you're interested in the specifics of EPA methods, ASTM methods, how to do them, to learn about customer testimonials and look at training and stuff, then Agilent actually has a link to PFAS testing. If you go to agilent.com directly under the applications and industry page, we have an entire section dedicated to PFAS testing, as I've highlighted here. And this talks about many of the regulatory methods. It has a number of videos and webinars from our applications chemists showing you how to do these analysis. So you can find methods, videos, application notes, training, and other things on here as well. So feel free to check that out. What I'm going to highlight here before we talk about the lab of the future is to highlight some of the challenges associated with PFAS testing. So one of the biggest challenges I already alluded to is the increased scope that many labs are facing. About 10 years back, we only cared about PFOA and PFAS. It was just two. And then in the unregulated contaminant monitoring rule by EPA, they were monitoring of 6 PFAS. Then we had newer EPA methods that had 18 and 25, and we keep increasing this list. And as I mentioned already, there are potentially over 4,000 PFAS in the environment. So we're going to see this increased scope from labs having to measure more and more PFAS and quantify them accurately. Adding to that, we're now finding more volatile PFAS, smaller chain PFAS, PFAS that have different end groups and different structures that are requiring multiple methods and techniques for analysis of PFAS. So again, this increased scope moves into not only the number of PFAS being measured, but also the kinds of different and new PFAS that we have to measure as well. Labs are being really stretched with increased throughput because of the increased demand and outcry for testing of PFAS. Labs are being pushed towards faster turnaround times that are being demanded. But also, like I mentioned, because of the new and different kinds and classes of PFAS we're finding, we're also having to find better methodologies, but also different kinds of analytical techniques to measure some of these PFAS as well. Another big thing with PFAS is the extremely low detection levels that are required and potential background issues because PFAS are ubiquitous. We are being required to monitor and measure PFAS at low or sub-part per trillion levels. To give you a frame of reference, semi-volatile organic compounds like, for example, EPA method 8270, we actually analyze these semi-volatiles at part per billion levels. So we're being asked to go thousands of times lower in terms of analysis on PFAS, all while these compounds are ubiquitous. We find them all over the place. They are used in our work environments and in lab products. So getting reliable analysis at such low levels without background is critical. And then finally, another challenge, especially for the contract testing labs, is the fast evolving regulations. There are new PFAS to be measured. There are different matrices. We're also now interested in them in air, biota, soil, and food products and other things as well. We're also coming up with new standard methods that labs have to be in tune with, but this also leads to a very important and critical aspect of data integrity and security and compliance. And so having to deal with audits and accreditation for this data is really critical as well. So these are some of the challenges that the lab faces. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take a step into the future, and I want you to think about lab of the future, and I'm going to talk about what this lab is going to be doing. So for the rest of this presentation, what I'd like you to think about is a short time in the future in a galaxy that's really, really close. A full service PFAS lab exists that has mastered the ability to get maximum throughput, efficiency, and quality of their PFAS analysis. So we're going to talk about this lab of the future that's doing PFAS analysis. Before that, what are some of the things that are going to change in this PFAS lab in the future? Looking back, they're going to say, well, compliance testing is getting important now, but it's a huge thing in the future, and so it's only going to continue to grow. Another area that there's going to be a lot of focus on is around research and forensics based testing to identify where contamination sources of PFAS are coming from. This is going to increase in the future. An area where we've only just started talking about this that is going to become a big thing in the future is surrogate and indicator testing for PFAS. So using quick tests, potentially even in the field, where we can judge if there is PFAS contamination, and if so, if there is contamination, then moving on those sample sites for further detailed evaluation and testing of PFAS, and identifying individual PFAS compounds is going to become big, and I'll talk about that in the next few slides. Turnaround times are only going to decrease, so there's going to be demand to get this analysis done faster and faster. And as I mentioned also, there are going to be additional matrices that we're going to have to be measuring PFAS in, such as air, food, commercial products, and others. Data compliance and security is going to become a big thing just in general. We've seen a lot of malicious intent in using and accessing data in the recent. That's only going to increase in the future. But with also PFAS, it can be a sensitive topic because some of the contamination is associated with government sites and Department of Defense and things like that. So compliance and security is going to be a huge thing. The one thing that is going to go down though is analysis costs, both in terms of the demand, but also by labs becoming more efficient and in tune with this analysis. These labs are going to be able to reduce the cost of analysis through a number of ways of increasing throughput and optimizing efficiency that I'm going to talk about with this lab of the future. So for the remainder of this talk, we're going to talk about this PFAS lab of the future, and I'm going to break down the talk into two things. First, I'm going to talk about what lab that is offering PFAS as a full service PFAS testing lab, what are the kinds of testing they will provide. And then secondly, we'll move into what are the attributes that this lab follows to maximize their efficiency, increase throughput, and also provide data compliance and integrity of the highest standards. Spoiler alert, this success is only achieved by this lab of the future through close collaboration with their partners. And when I'm talking about partners, I'm talking about both their suppliers of the instrumentation and parts and also their final end clients. The only way this PFAS lab of the future can be successful is through a close collaboration with all these folks. Okay, so when we think about the offerings in a full service PFAS testing lab in the future, they can really be divided into three formats or three functions. The first thing, as I mentioned, is that this lab of the future will be offering surrogate and indicator analyses for PFAS. So these will typically be the analysis of like organic fluorine or some sort of reduction products to estimate PFAS. And this most common examples will be measuring for total fluorine with combustion IC, or measuring for organic fluorine breakdown products by a GC or GCMS. And then also potentially the top assay and the PIGI assays will be important as well for this lab to kind of provide, quick analysis of whether the samples are contaminated with PFAS, and if so, do they require more detailed testing. If they do require more detailed testing, the labs will be offering targeted PFAS analysis. This really is and will continue to be the gold standard of PFAS testing, where we will be doing targeted quantification of a known list of PFAS. And while the LC-MS analysis is already critical today, because we will start to find more volatile PFAS in the environment, GCM SMS part is going to become very important as well. And then there's going to be the addition of several different and new matrices as well. For example, water, air, soil, food, consumer products, etc. Finally, and a big area of revenue growth opportunity for these PFAS labs of the future is actually in untargeted and unknown PFAS analysis. So this is where they are doing a non-targeted analysis to screen and identify PFASs that we don't have standards for, or that we don't even know are present in the environment yet. And so here you have two critical techniques, which is the GC high resolution mass spectrometry and the LC high resolution mass spectrometry instruments that will be critical in identifying and screening these new PFAS compounds. And a huge sub area in here is environmental forensics, as I mentioned earlier, with the coupling of chemometric techniques such as data analysis and data processing, where we can actually identify sources of these PFAS contamination coming from that become really important. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was this analysis or surrogate or indicator analysis of PFAS compounds, right? So the goal really here is not to identify specific PFAS, but is actually to identify whether there is potential PFAS contamination in these samples, and if so, do they require individual identification of PFAS. So the critical aspects of the surrogate and indicator tests is that they must be rapid to perform, have really quick turnaround times, and be able to do with an easy and less expensive workflow and instrumentation. So one of the things I want to highlight is the measuring of organic fluorine by GC based methods. So there are three different ways to do this. One of them is to just monitor for organic fluorine peaks using a GC electron capture detector, and just then summing those peaks up to get kind of a pseudo concentration, and then determining if that's a high level that requires that sample be analyzed further. A second way of looking at this is by reducing the individual PFAS to a final product that can be analyzed using a GC electron capture detector. So this can be done as well by either reducing the PFAS down to some end product that we can measure. And then finally, by reducing the chromatography, if the analysis is done by a GC mass spec, then this analysis can be done really rapidly. As shown here, you can actually do this analysis in about 4 or 5 minutes and have really quick turnaround times of measuring just the degradation product or breakdown product of the potential PFAS, and then knowing if the PFAS loading potentially in that sample is high or not for further evaluation. Another quick way, or a surrogate or indicator way of analyzing PFAS, is the use of total fluorine measurement by combustion ion chromatography. So here I want to thank my friends, especially Jay Gandhi at Metrome USA, to provide a couple of these slides to explain this technique. Basically what happens here is the system takes a single liquid sample and completes both a free fluoride analysis using the direct ion chromatograph, and then a total fluorine analysis with the combustion technology as well. And then these two can be combined, so you can add up the total organic fluoride with the free fluorine and then get the total fluorine amount that gives you a surrogate indicator of potential PFAS load in the sample. And all this can on the instrument be done really quickly. Now also highlighting this system is, it provides very robust combustion efficiency, so you get robust data across different samples, and it offers a large flexibility of injection volumes, and also the ability to go low into the part per billion range in terms of concentration. And typically the low part per billion range is where you would expect a sum of PFAS or fluorinated compounds. So this is really a sensitive instrument for what it's worth, and something that can give you fast and rapid surrogate information on total organic fluorine. One of the slight disadvantages here is, of course, it requires a solid phase extraction sample preparation, and that in itself can actually take some time, while potentially also adding a little bit of background to the system as well. So something to be aware of. But these are the surrogate ways of looking into it. The other thing I want to highlight is, moving on to the second form where targeted analysis of PFAS happens. And so here I'm showing some examples from colleagues at Gerstel, and I'd like to credit Kurt Thaxton from Gerstel for this data, is the analysis of PFAS in air. This is only going to increase and be a greater factor of interest for us, because we do know, and there are many studies now that show that significant portion of PFAS can actually volatilize and move into the air, and so that potentially is an issue. One of the benefits of using GCMS is it can be directly coupled to thermal desorption, or also other forms of sample introduction for air analysis like canisters. And so that makes it really suitable to use a GCMS for analysis of PFAS. Furthermore, many volatile PFAS are only amenable to the GC analysis. So then hence using the GCMS is a big benefit as well. So here is an example showing an analysis on a DB624 column where you get separation on using a thermal desorber with a GC single quad instrument for the perfluorocarboxylic acids. But there can also be some issues by using a GC-MSD or a GC single quad, right? For example, some of these compounds have in sim mode have very low M over Zs. For example, here 82FTOH has a 31, and we know basically that low mass equal to high noise, and so this could potentially have a risk of false positives. But we can solve this, and spoiler alert, the way to solve it is actually using a GC-MS-MS instrument or a GC triple quadrupole instrument. Here is the same spike of that 82FTOH, and you notice that basically the GC triple quad instrument coupled with the thermal desorber completely makes the baseline disappear because of the background elimination you get from using a triple quadrupole instrument. So using an MRM over a SIM is a big benefit for the analysis of PFAS, and so hence we can see that using a GC triple quad might be significantly more beneficial than a GC single quad instrument when analyzing PFAS, especially in matrices such as air, where coupling it to sample introduction like a canister or a thermal desorber is a big benefit. The gold standard, though, for analysis of PFAS currently is and will continue to be the use of an LC triple quadrupole instrument or LC-MS-MS, right? And so many of our regulatory methods like EPA and ASTM and ISO methods use an LC-MS-MS for targeted quantification of PFAS, and that's really not going to change. There will be 3 different ways of doing this for the lab of the future, and that involves where sample enrichment is suggested, where you don't need as sensitive a mass spec instrument, but you require something that's robust and can deal with routine quantification. Then you also have the dilute and shoot methods, which is like the ASTM methods, where you dilute your sample with methanol. You don't do SPE, but then you just inject it on the instrument. So here you require a more robust instrument with more sensitivity, so you can measure those low levels without sample preparation and concentration. But you also require it to be able to take a tougher matrix loading on as well. And then finally, you have the direct injection approaches, where you can use ultimate sensitivity of the newest generation mass specs. And this also kind of future proofs your lab a little bit, right? Because as I mentioned, levels for PFAS are going to only continue to drop in terms of what we measure. And having the most sensitive instrument kind of future proofs your lab for the next 10 or 15 years, so that if those levels drop, you don't have to again purchase another instrument that's more sensitive. What I want to do and talk about a little bit more is not about the triple quad instruments, but talk about how using LC high resolution MS here with accurate mass actually fits into the lab of the future, and how they can use this to generate revenue and solve new PFAS problems. All right. So one of the things is using a LC high resolution MS instrument can actually be coupled with databases that are available, either custom open source databases or curated databases for PFAS like this one from a vendor. And you can actually screen for hundreds of PFAS in your sample without requiring analytical standards or without targeting them in the triple quadrupole, where you have to do some compound optimization, right? So here's an example of using this custom database with over 150 PFAS compounds, and we were able to identify without an analytical standard requirement some other PFAS compounds in wastewater samples as well. So suspect screening using libraries and databases is a huge benefit and a potential way of testing labs generating revenue, because now you can actually identify PFAS and give your customers additional information without very much extra work required in terms of analytical standards and optimization of the instrument and stuff. The other way to use this is by using chemometrics and smart techniques of identifying new PFAS. And I'd like to credit Jeremy Colmel and his team from Yale University for this slide, where basically what they've done is through the software you can actually plot mass defect against nominal mass. And so here what it helps you do is, using the Kendrick mass defect and chemometrics, you can identify a whole new series of PFAS from just identifying one single compound. And that's what the chart here is showing, with a number of different kinds of PFAS end groups, but also a number of different different substructures of them through the nominal mass defect measurement. And in this case, it's normalized to the CF2 measurement. So why is all this important? Why is producing this additional information on a QTOF important? Well, this slide should highlight that. All right, this is our real wastewater influent and effluent samples collected, and when the samples were analyzed, only 6% of the PFAS compounds that were identified were done through a targeted method. That is, ones that we had standards for that were run in the lab. So that 20 to 30 standards that you have only identified about 6% of the organic fluorine containing compounds in these wastewater influent and effluent samples. Another 10 to 16% of the fluorinated compounds were identified through the databases that I talked about. So that itself is, pretty much tripling the amount of PFAS that you can identify just using those databases that are available through vendors or other sources. But there's still about 60 to 80% of organic fluorinated compounds in these samples that we don't know what they are. We couldn't identify them either through the suspect databases or the targeted analysis through standards. So what that's telling us is there's potentially a large amount of fluorinated anionic compounds, most of which could be PFAS, that is actually present in these wastewater samples that we don't know of. All right, and so that's where the benefits of using software like the chemometric tools that I talked about in the last slide and the LC-QTOF come in. The other tool for identifying new PFAS is actually the ion mobility coupled to an LC-QTOF instrument. This is what I like to call as the ultimate tool for PFAS identification, or the forensic hunter, because we can actually use this tool to not only find new PFAS, but we can use this actually to identify specific sources of contamination and where they're coming off from PFAS as well. So for these next few slides, I'd like to credit Erin Baker and James Dodds, who've collected this data on their Agilent ion mobility mass spec instrument for PFAS. So briefly, what does an ion mobility mass spec do? As I mentioned, it's coupled to an LC-QTOF. So the LC-QTOF uses the high resolution accurate mass, but critically uses that along with isotope patterns and isotope fidelity to identify chemical structures. What an ion mobility does is actually couples that and actually addresses or kind of also has a drift tube, and the drift tube can actually separate out isomers or molecules that have the same mass but different shapes. And so that becomes really critical now, because we can actually start to separate out PFAS isomers. Why is that important? Because PFAS manufacturing can be quite tricky, and different processes used to monitor PFAS can actually provide different signatures of isotopes and other impurities as well. So if you're able to separate out the different isotopic signatures, then we can actually potentially say what mechanism was used to produce the PFAS, and that can actually be linked back to specific sources of where the contamination is coming from. So here Erin and James are actually showing the difference between an impure PFAS that has many different isomers and a standard that was obtained from a vendor as well, that is basically only has the linear isomer as well. Similarly, here they are showing that they were able to identify up to 7 different isomers of PFAS specifically on the ion mobility. That was quite critical, and then this can be used for fingerprinting and forensics analysis later on as well. The other avenue that I want to highlight, is use of the GC high resolution MS or GC QTOF. And here I'm showing the analysis of a more volatile fluorotelomere alcohol, the 4,2-FTOH, that was identified by a GC QTOF. But the question to address here is, why is it important to have a QTOF instrument, an accurate mass versus a nominal mass? Say, could you do this with a GC single quad? Well, an example here is, when we look at that FTOH, we notice that there was a loss of 38. Oh, actually, the loss is specifically of 38.0168 when we look at the accurate mass, and that tells us that this molecule is actually losing an H2O and HF. Whereas if we used a nominal unit mass instrument, then 38 might have told us that it could have also been a loss of an F2, and that would have led us to the wrong structure. So hence, this accurate mass tool is really critical. And what we can then actually do is, because we know that specific classes of PFAS lose specific breakdown products like the H2O and HF here, we can actually trace it to identify different classes of PFAS that might be present in that sample as well. And that's exactly what we can actually use the GCQ-TOF for. So these are some of the tools that the lab of the future, or some of the methodologies that they'd be using to identify new PFAS, to quantify PFAS, and actually to make revenue off of them. What I want to do now is to focus the rest of the talk on how this lab can optimize and be the most efficient at running the most number of PFAS samples in a high throughput environment. So for the PFAS lab of the future, the golden metric is return on investment, or ROI. This is the absolute critical for contract testing labs, and it's a decision they have to make whether to get into PFAS testing, on how can they make sure the return on investment is the best that they can get. Alright, and so with that, what we've done is we've divided it into 7 attributes that the lab of the future thinks about when they're talking about a return on investment. The first attribute is the billable throughput and turnaround time. So as I mentioned to you, and the figure on the left shows, the PFAS lab of the future is going to be doing a number of different PFAS testing, on an LCMS, on an LC-Q-TOF, on a GC single quad, a GC triple quad, and then also a GC and an IC as well, and other instruments. And so putting all of this data together and submitting it to their client is going to determine how quickly they can turn that around, because at the end of the day, the lab's revenue is going to be determined by the number of samples they can run and the price they charge for that. So the more samples they can run, the better. And the lab's turnaround time is going to be dependent on the billable throughput, right? So the first lesson to understand is that, while instrument speeds and the method of analysis defines this turnaround time, also coupling this to the different analyses is quite critical as well. So that's something to think about. And the entire workflow is what determines their turnaround time, not just the instrument analysis time. And that's where, sample preparation can often be the limiting factor in the turnaround time. And so here is where the lab of the future makes use of automated sample preparation analysis. Automated offline sample prep for PFAS, as I'm showing here with courtesy to our colleagues at LC Tech, this is actually a dedicated sample prep unit to analyze PFAS. And what it does is it minimizes the fluoroplastic components, it reduces the PFAS background, it also provides robust automation for 24/7 operation. And what that critically allows labs to do is it allows labs to do batching. And what I mean by batching is they can be doing sample preparation while the instrument is running the previous batch, and vice versa, so that you have both aspects of your workflow, the sample preparation and the instrument running at the same time. And critically, if one goes down, it doesn't affect the entire operation of the PFAS as well. So what are some of the things that an automated offline sample preparation requires? Well, this system will be operated and equipped with polypropylene bottles that are critical for PFAS to avoid contamination. And also the tubing will be fluoropolymer free. The system also will have the ability to automatically use multiple cartridges, elution into different containers and things like that. So it allows that flexibility, all while having the ability to load samples and rinse out bottles automatically with different organic solvents. And finally, it has intuitive software with preloaded PFAS methods and also drag and drop editing, so customers can do different things on there as well. So this is how the lab of the future becomes efficient in the sample prep, by using automated offline SPE. However, labs of the future also have the versatility to run automated online solid phase extraction coupled to the instrument. So here really what happens is the sample preparation is coupled actually to the analytical instrument or the LCMS instrument here, and this actually allows much faster turnaround times because you require very low volumes without sacrificing the sensitivity of analysis for this PFAS as well. Some of the benefits of the online SPE system are it reduces sample volumes, as I mentioned, with really no loss in sensitivity, still being allowing us to measure the low nanogram per liter levels. It also reduces the solvent and internal standard usage because you are having to now spike a lot lower amount of sample. Instead of having to spike hundreds of ml of water sample, you're only going to spike like a mil or two, and it also reduces the solvent required because you're treating lesser amounts as well. It increases reproducibility and reduces potential contamination points because there's less human intervention involved. And most importantly, it produces faster turnaround time and faster results because the entire method, coupling the online SPE to the analysis can take anywhere between just 20 and 30 minutes as against offline SPE that can itself take several hours to do. Now, it's not just about sample preparation though in terms of optimizing throughput. Sample handling and storage advances can be a big benefit as well, and it's not always the big things that make a big difference. Small stuff in your workflow can make a big difference as well. For example, PTFE lining and caps can have PFAS contamination, and so you can contaminate your samples by piercing PTFE septa. Hence, the lab of the future uses, specialized vials and caps, and this is a unique bilayer cap made of polypropylene that is available through Agilent now, that also allows potential resealing once it's pierced. So what that means is it actually reduces and lowers evaporation of your sample. So instead of now the lab using 2 or more caps per sample to analyze them and store them, they can now just use a single cap as well, and that results in savings as well. The other benefit on the vials is using a screw top polypropylene vials prevents any adsorption to glass and also potential introduction of contamination because there are no fluoropolymers in here as well. The lab of the future will be running PFC free kits, and really, PFAS are ubiquitous, as I mentioned. They can be present in solvents, filtration apparatus, Teflon lined tubings and stuff. And one of the places they can also be present is actually in the LC itself, right? And so that's why designing the LC to eliminate all the potential PFAS contaminant parts like fluoropolymers and things like that is something that Agilent has already taken care of. We have a PFC free kit that is available, and it makes changes to multiple different parts that are addressed in the PFC kit. And the lab of the future will make use of this thing to make sure there is very minimal PFAS background in your analysis. Now, another attribute that labs of the future for PFAS analysis must have is this multi-dimensional agility, right? So one of the things I mentioned is the lab of the future will be doing multiple different kinds of PFAS analysis with different instruments. And that's important because, if one aspect of that is delayed, then at least you have additional means or sources of revenue. Whereas if you look at Lab A in this figure that is only using an LC-MS for analysis, then they are limited in both scope and the amount of samples that they can run. And if something goes wrong or goes down with the LC-MS, then basically they've lost a big chunk of revenue generation potential. Whereas Lab B that couples different analysis with the GC-MS, LC-MS, high resolution and other kinds of analyses actually has multiple sources of making revenue as well, and can increase their capacity, but also get faster and better turnaround times as well. And one of the ways of increasing turnaround times is actually reducing time in method development and method validation. So tools such as the PFAS MRM database for LC triple quad is really important here. This is basically a curated database of 100 PFAS compounds that in a drag and drop fashion you can actually add to your analysis. What this allows you to do is to potentially future-proof your lab by, making sure you have new PFAS that can easily be added on to your methods, but it also significantly saves on method development and optimization time because all that work is already done in the database. So basically what it is, you can easily and quickly, you don't have to buy expensive individual standards and spend unnecessary time optimizing the mass spec and the identifying the critical acquisition parameters, because all that is already present in the database for 100 plus PFAS as well. So this helps you, get to expand your PFAS methods very quickly. A critical aspect for the lab of the future is comprehensive quality management. And this is where it comes into play about, how safe is the data? Are you in compliance, and do you have data integrity and security tools as well, right? So Agilent takes this very seriously, and in our key features for our compliance and data integrity tools involve, mandatory logging in, so we know who's using the instrument. Also role-based security, so not that everyone has access to everything, but you can actually have it role-based that's defined by the lab. Also adding and removing privileges, ability to override protection on the software, and method versioning, audit trails, and electronic signatures and things of that are really critical as well. What's also really critical, though, is the ability, as I mentioned, for this lab of the future to have compliance that's interchangeable and relatable to different kinds of analysis as well. So the Agilent software that offers our compliance is the Open Lab ECM, and specifically in Mass Hunter, it has compliance for the GCMS, LCMS, also for our software and ICP-MS tools as well. So this is important, and labs can always use a subset of these if they want, but knowing that it's possible to expand out to the entire environment as well. And some of the critical aspects of our Open Lab ECM data management and compliance is, the centralized data management, long-term archival on a server, also indexing and regulatory compliance to specific regulations, along with audit trails as well for multiple instruments in the environment. And what's critical to learn here and to know here is these are not just limited to Agilent instrumentation, but they can actually be expanded out to other instruments as well. For example, when I talked about earlier the Metrome ion chromatography instrument, that actually can sit in this environment as well. It actually does comply and sits with our Open Lab ECM and can be used in this environment too. Another attribute that is important for labs to understand is fast but realistic implementation times, right? And this touches back on what I talked about also with the method development aspect, where what is critical for the labs is not just to determine, how the initial cost of the equipment is, but how quickly can you get to running billable samples. And so, if it takes a lot longer to develop and implement a method from vendor A, even if the cost is a little lower, it actually might be more beneficial for you to invest in a little bit more cost of the instrument, but have the method implemented a lot faster as well. And so critical things that are tied into this are, the availability of services and support, having the technical consulting available from the vendor, and the ability, and their expertise to help you set up multiple different methods and future-proof your lab with training, and also with, having ready-made methods and things like that as well. So again, something to think about for the lab of the future. The other thing to mention is downtime costs, right? No matter what anyone claims or the features, PFAS testing instruments will always have downtime. There's no doubt about that. But it becomes critical where in defining that downtime, right? Routine maintenance is expected, but as long as it's routine and fairly infrequent, then that's okay. It can be dealt with, and can be budgeted for. What's really critical to labs is not having unplanned downtime, right? And here is where, having your entire workflow being robust, having good sample preparation so it doesn't junk up the instrument, but also halting your operations from time to time. Also having tools on the instrument that help you do maintenance very quickly and actually provide you early feedback if maintenance is required is very critical as well. Then critically also making sure that you don't have software issues, right? Having simple software that your operators are not spending weeks to learn and relearn, and also having interchangeability, right? For example, the Mass Hunter environment allows you to run that same software on a GCMS, LCMS, ICP-MS as well. So that cross trainability of your operators is critical as well. One of the biggest things that is not thought of by labs is that they often do not think about technologies to future proof the lab, right? It's always looking at things that can just about meet regulations at this time. That can become a real problem though, because as PFAS regulations drop, you don't want to be in a place where you haven't future proofed your lab and then are requiring to invest in newer capital again as well. So something to think about there too. So when we talk about maintenance, I just want to highlight a couple of tools that can potentially make a big difference. Here is an example of the wax shield on the Agilent LC-MS MS tools, right? What this tool does is it allows you to clean your capillary, and it allows you to go and do that without venting the instrument. So by keeping it in vacuum, right? So this actually reduces your maintenance, your routine maintenance time from anywhere from 6 hours to less than 30 minutes, which is a huge saving for a lab, right? Just to save that amount of time and billable samples that you can run. I also mentioned that the GC, is important and will become important for PFAS analysis. Here I want to highlight the Intuvo and the guard chip, right? So the guard chip is very critical and proprietary to the Intuvo and doesn't require column trimming. So what does this mean to you? It really is protect, don't repair. So, like I like to say here, column trimming is so 2019. Changing out the guard chip takes less than 5 minutes as against trimming and, venting and potentially doing other things for the instrument when column trimming. But here is the big savings, right? And a guard chip Intuvo instrument, you just replace it out in 5 minutes and there is no change in retention time because you haven't changed the length of the column. Whereas on older instrumentation on GCs, you actually have to then do a couple of injections just to adjust the retention time again. And this is lost time. This is if your method is 30 or 40 minutes long on a GCMS, you're talking about potentially being down for about 2 hours, whereas a guard chip is a 5-minute process and a lot easier to do. So when we look at that whole maintenance ecosystem, really what you want is you want instrument intelligence and quicker diagnostics. You almost want the instrument to give you that early maintenance feedback to let you know, right? And that's exactly what Agilent is striving to do. Forget about having to log, in lab notebooks and stuff. The instrument actually does all this for you. It logs when maintenance is required. It tells you when things potentially could be dirty and need to be cleaned and things like that as well. So this is really the lab of the future, making use of these sophisticated softwares to let it determine when maintenance is required and how it needs to be done. Now finally, the other thing to consider is always indirect costs, like I mentioned, right? Having simple software that is easy to train and also cross-train your different users at. If they can use the same software on LCMS and GCMS and ICP-MS, that's critical as well. But it's also important to keep a track of everything in the workflow, not just the instrument, right? And this is where keeping track of the changing instrument consumables and preventative maintenance becomes critical. And Agilent has tools like the Agilent Smart Alert to do this for you. So really what this tool is it basically is a software you install on the instrument, and it actually has alert set points, and it will alert you on when to do maintenance and when consumables are running out and for you to order, so that you're not left in a gap where you're missing things as well. And then it can also perform certain recommended and routine maintenance so that it knows the instrument is always running at highest performance, and this can be accessed remotely as well. So all of this, the smart alerts, the early maintenance feedback that I talked about is part of Agilent's digital lab program, right? The goal really is to go away from where you are buried in manual and redundant data entry, so that all you have to do is enter the information once. And it also is to eliminate any operational errors as well, to make sure the instrument is judging when these maintenance and things need to happen and how they need to happen as well. So the critical aspects of our digital lab program is the end-to-end sample tracking, comprehensive system utilization. So it's always performing at its topmost level, to eliminate manual tasks, and also then to provide and perform automated diagnostics so that this reduces the burden and costs on the lab, right? So with that, my thing to you is, reach out to Agilent if you're interested in this. We would love to partner with you through the digital lab program to improve your PFAS analysis in the future. And the last thing for all labs to consider, right, is you must consider the overall affordability of your analysis workflow and methods as against just the initial cost of the capital, right? While the capital cost can sound large, it can actually really be minimal when you think about the entire workflow and how much when you tie that into return on investment, as some of the things that I've mentioned as well. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your time. Feel free to contact me if you have any questions, and if you want more information on Agilent PFAS consumables, instrumentations, and databases, feel free to follow these links. Thanks again, and stay safe.